What's up, y'all? You're watching Union Minded. I'm your host, Eric, and today we're going to get into how context matters when we're choosing words and how we're using words and how those words should be taken. Context matters. I was, just like most people, wrapped up in the Montgomery Brawl watching videos, and I kept seeing the term rednecks being thrown out to describe the entitled white folks that thought they could float around and then found out. But I kept seeing this term and I kept hearkening back in my mind thinking, well, I remember rednecks being used to describe the Union miners at the Battle of Blair Mountain. And it was kind of a sign that they were part of the working class fighting back against the corporation of the time, which would be the mine owners of the time. And so I was like, well, that kind of, I didn't, it's funny how propaganda will have you changing the term and what it means, right? That's just my mind, because I'm reading all these books about unions and everything else. But then you realize, as I should know, and as most of us should realize, the more you read, the more you realize you don't know. And thank God. So read. It's important. But I wanted to, in that context, bring you the Battle of Blair Mountain and what I thought of as the term redneck. And I'm going to change that from now on. I'll be using it more like Union redneck and differentiate a little bit. But let's find out why. So let's dive on in. And I'm going to put the links to these articles in the description box for you. Don't forget to like, comment, share, all that good stuff. All right, here we go. The Battle of Blair Mountain, as brought to you by Zen Education Project. This is a description by the author of one of the key events, the Battle of Blair Mountain, featured in the book by James Green. So here we go. You ready? August 31st marks the anniversary of the largest civil insurrection in U.S. history after the Civil War. This uprising, which has been all but lost to memory, was the climax of two mine wars fought in the West Virginia coal fields from 1912 to 1921. At a time when many citizens are worrying about economic inequality, we're at the highest levels of economic inequality in the history of the U.S. currently today. Keep that in mind. Worrying about economic inequality when conservatives are bewailing the use of class warfare language, when insurgents are still being imprisoned without due process, when police forces in poor communities are being privatized and militarized, when banks are ordering evictions, it is worth discovering, exploring, and understanding the West Virginia mine wars, a profound but largely unknown expression of class struggle. So again, at a time of economic inequality, where conservatives are yelling about the use of the language of class warfare, when police are being militarized, you should look to the West Virginia mine wars. Let's find out why. Armed insurgency erupted in the coal mining counties of southern West Virginia in late August of 1921, when an army of more than 8,000 rifle-bearing Union miners marched toward Mingo County on the Kentucky border. They intended to liberate other miners and their families from the tyranny imposed by private mine guards who had terrorized the region for more than a decade, and from a regime of martial law imposed by the governor. Armed warfare erupted on August 31st, 1921 on Blair Mountain in Logan County, when the miners' army clashed with armed forces marshaled by the county sheriff, the coal companies, and the state police. See, back then, the companies was the government in the mine towns. The company owned the housing, the banks. They paid their workers in scrip, which wasn't even U.S. currency, and if they wanted to trade that for U.S. currency, they actually had to take a loss because the company charged them 25% on top of that. Talk about tyranny and dominion. And in a current society, you could talk about Walmart towns, where Walmart comes in and puts every other small business that's similar to it out of business. And then the poor folks in that community are forced to work at Walmart because there's no other jobs that are in the area. Similarities. The 3-day Battle of Blair Mountain was the climax of a war that had rocked West Virginia since the early years of the 20th century, when the United Mine Workers, led by Mother Jones, tried repeatedly to penetrate tightly controlled company coal towns. In the spring of 1912, Union miners struck in the Paint Creek Cabin Creek region near Charleston after they were evicted from company houses, and then suffered armed assaults on their encampments by private police. 12 strikers and 13 company men died in the first West Virginia 13-month struggle that verged on civil war. The strikers' solidarity held firm across racial lines and inspired the poet Ralph Chaplin to write "Solidarity Forever," the song that eventually became the anthem of the U.S. labor movement. So across racial lines, this inequality was felt so deeply that these mine workers united under the red handkerchief that they wore in the mines, making them rednecks, the red handkerchief that would protect them from the dust. And we'll get into that. A second mine war threatened on May 19, 1920, as a result of a sensational shootout on the streets of Matewan in Mingo County, where the pro-Union sheriff Sid Hatfield and his deputies killed 7 private detectives who had evicted scores of striker families from their homes. The gun battle made the front page of the New York Times and made Hatfield a notorious celebrity. John Sayles dramatized these events in the gripping '87 film Matewan. Skirmishing continued until the summer of 21, as Union organizers tried to penetrate the company-dominated Mingo County on the Tug River, the state's western border. In response, the governor declared martial law in that strife-torn county. As a result, scores of Union men were imprisoned and held incommunicado. The governor's declaration of martial law created a furious reaction among unionized coal miners in other parts of the state. On August 20, hundreds of miners gathered at Lenz Creek, south of the capital, armed and ready to march on Mingo County to liberate the Union men imprisoned under the martial law decree. The next day's headline of a front-page story in the New York Times read, Terror in mine area as 4,000 armed men moved toward Mingo. An army of malcontents composed of Union miners and not a few ex-servicemen, where the story continued, engaged in a violent protest against the mine guard system that had long prevailed in the troubled region. It was further reported that insurgents commandeered passenger trains, cut telephone wires, looted coal company stores of arms and ammunition, and executed 2 alleged company spies. President Harding, eager to escape the sweltering White House for an August cruise, was forced to stay on and meet with senators and generals in the War Department because he was informed that West Virginia was on the brink of civil war. To reach Mingo, the Union forces had to cross over Blair Mountain and pass through Logan County, where it was reported that wild alarm spread through the area with news of a coming invasion. In response, Sheriff Chaffin mobilized a small army of 3,000 deputies to stop invaders. On August 30, Harding issued a proclamation ordering all persons engaged in insurrection proceedings to disband. In 2 days, the order never reached the armed miners. So he told them, if you're thinking about coming over here, you got to disband in 2 days. But that word never got to them. On August 31st, the two forces collided and the mountain valleys reverberated with rifle and machine gun fire for 2 days. The arrival of battle-tested U.S. Army troops finally put a stop to the battle. The insurgent miners said they were willing to surrender to Uncle Sam and let the U.S. Army put an end to the fighting, but they never would surrender to their sworn enemies, the coal operators, and the men they hired to do their heavy work. Even though they failed in their strategic objectives, the Union miners believed their armed march had called the nation's attention to the state of terrorism they had endured for so many years in West Virginia company towns. It soon became clear that the Union miners could claim no final victory in this quasi-civil war. Their insurgent leaders were put on trial for treason. The hated mine guard system and all the abuses it protected were kept in force, and the Union was driven underground. 12 hard and bitter years passed before the Union resurfaced in West Virginia during the time when a social earthquake rocked the nation. Then, in the first years of the Great Depression, the leaders of the miners March of 21 reappeared and began to revive what the writer Edmund Wilson called the unbroken spirit of the West Virginia miners. So when you read about the Battle of Blair Mountain, you learn about the handkerchiefs, and you walk away saying, oh, that's where the term redneck comes from. And so I was looking it up, and I just wanted more information. Maybe the term redneck, comes from something older than that I really thought I was unlearning, but maybe there was more to the story. So I went to dive a little deeper, and I found this article on Slate that kind of gave me a pretty good understanding. At least it makes sense to me. But I'm going to select the part of this article. You can read it. I'm going to put it in the description box like I told you. But let's pick it up from here. I too was confused to hear this new version of an old bit of folk wisdom and went to check up on it. The Oxford English Dictionary defines derogatory uses for redneck when defined as a poorly educated white person working as an agricultural laborer or from a rural area in the southern United States, typically considered as holding bigoted or reactionary attitudes. And this definition is much earlier than 1921, 1891, 1904, 1913. What gives? I emailed Kat, who was a history professor, to ask if she had heard the episode, came from a podcast, that she appeared in, and what she thought of the way the interview had been edited. She wrote that she hadn't had a chance to listen, but she wrote, "It was not my intention to claim the mine wars as the origin of the term, but instead to periodize its transformation from a more generic epithet to something specific to a group identity and union membership, particularly in coal miners, which is built into the way that many folks in Appalachia today reclaim the term." Now that makes sense. And we'll keep reading because it gets a little deeper than that. Abu Murad, for his part, replied to an email inquiry by acknowledging the error. He said, "I might not have used the right words," he wrote. "The etymology is older and more complex and disputed. My main point was simply that poor white Southerners are often labeled with slurs that historically could be read to mean the opposite of what we think they mean. The history of disputation around the uses of the term is what's most interesting here. And it's also what resists a just so story about the word's origins." Kat pointed me to a 2006 article by historian Patrick Huber in the journal Western Folklore that she said formed the basis for her own interpretation. Huber's argument that redneck in the 1910s through the 1930s sometimes meant communist, or at least a miner who was a member of a labor union, especially one on strike, made it clear that this usage was a strategic reclamation of a word that had been used as a slur. Some union organizers, Huber found, used red bandanas and the term redneck as a way to culturally integrate groups of white, black, and immigrant miners who were often set against each other by the owners eager to divide labor's power into a single identity. That was smart organizing. Because miners often wore red handkerchiefs to protect their faces and necks from coal dust, the bandana was a symbol of labor that was universal among ethnicities and races. Here is part of a song collected by industrial folklorist George Corson, which dates to 1927. "Rednecks, keep them scabs away. Rednecks, fight them every day. Now any old time you see a scab passing by, now don't hesitate, blacken both of his eyes." Scabs are bad, don't be a scab. At the same time, in a derivation that Huber calls ambiguous, coal operators occasionally used redneck when meaning to invoke the term red to denigrate union members. In this bizarre turn of the screw, redneck in some specific times, and probably only a few places, actually functioned as an anti-communist slur. This podcast isn't the first time the red bandana etymology of rednecks has popped up in media over the past couple of years, as the coasts and big cities have become very interested again in what's going on in Appalachia. In Fahrenheit 11/9, Michael Moore, in conversation with then congressional candidate Richard Ojeda, notes that some strikers involved in the 2018 West Virginia teacher strike wore red bandanas as well. The bandanas have a special meaning going back to the 20s, when tens of thousands of coal miners went on strike wearing red bandanas around their necks to identify themselves as pro-union and thus popularizing the term redneck, Moore says. That popularizing does important work, but it seems Moore might have elided it later in public appearances. At a 2018 screening of the documentary at the Toronto International Film Festival, according to the Austin American-Statesman Charles Ely. Audience members received red bandanas upon entering the theater. Moore then asked them to tie them around their necks. He said a skeptical Ely reported that the term redneck derived from members of labor unions in the coal industry who wore red bandanas to signify their loyalty. Is it picking nits to call left-leaning media on this mistake? The other origin story makes for such a fun factoid, and clearly it's more encouraging to audiences who may be worried about Trump supporters to hear that redneck has its definite origin in union activity. But it is, as always, more complicated than that. The part of the story that describes people's purposeful reclamation of a negative term in service of unity and empowerment should also be told. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And after my searching today and self-education a little bit today, you come back to the core message. Context matters in defining how a person is using language. Keep that in mind. My name's Eric. You're watching Union Minded. Let's keep in mind that the fight is not left and right. It is up and down. It's going to take solidarity to win always. Each one teach one. Get out there and reach one. And remember, there can be no union without you and I front and center. Peace.